Week 16 of the fantasy football season. And here's a few defense DST units I looked at off the wire this week. The first one, the Denver Broncos. I know the Broncos, they got the doors blown off from them, but this week here is a streaming option. They're definitely a good option in my opinion. I know they gave up 42 points in the Week 15 loss at the Detroit Lions. So this week a great matchup versus the Patriots. Third most fantasy points to DSTs on the season. And this Bronco defense was playing great up until that Lion game. So it was a quick hiccup, I believe, for this Bronco defense. They're going to get focused. They're back at home. And we know this Patriot offense is one of the worst offenses in the league. So this week is a streaming option with a great matchup where I think they could get to barely zap a decent amount of times in this game and hold them to mid-teens, low 20. They're available right now as this Bronco DST in 53% of fantasy leagues. Next DST is the Green Bay Packers. So the Packers, another team just like the Denver Broncos, where they gave up a lot of points and they lost 34-20 to the Tampa Bay Buccaneers in Week 15. 34 points in that one, 5 sacks, a fumble recovery. But this week, as a streaming option, I like them a lot at the Carolina Panthers that give up the second most fantasy points to DSTs on the season. So right now, Green Bay, we know they could get to the quarterback. I know Jair Alexander was out in that ball game, but this week here, I think Green Bay bounces back. And this season pretty much is over 6-8 on the year for the Packers, but you know they're going to go out there and play hard. And I think if the Panthers, a team that can't move the football well, and Bryce Young's had a tough season all year, they could go out there and put in a good performance as a streaming option also as well, available in 53% of fantasy leagues. Next DST is the Cincinnati Bengals. So the Bengals, their defense is a middle of the pack type of D this year. I know last week they had a few turnovers and almost a third, but offsides negated a pick six in that ball game where they gave up 24 points allowed versus Minnesota, 3 sacks, 2 interceptions. So right now their defense the last couple weeks has played good, and this week is a streaming option as well. A great matchup at division rival, the Pittsburgh Steelers, that give up, I know, the 20th most fantasy points to the DSTs on the season, but the Steelers offense can't really move the football. They're not scoring touchdowns. Mitch Trubisky, he's been pretty bad since he's filled in for Kenny Pickett. And now they might even go to Mason Rudolph, who we saw come in later in that ball game in Week 15 for that Pittsburgh Steelers team. So right now, Cincinnati available in 52% of fantasy leagues. I think, once again, they're a DST that could go out there as a streaming option and help fantasy owners because they could get pressure on the quarterback. They got a decent secondary with some ball hawk. And this week here versus a pretty weak Pittsburgh offense, like I mentioned, with not much going, they're definitely an option this week. Next DST is the Washington Commanders. I know this Commander DST all season hasn't done anything, but this week here is a 1-week use only. They're definitely a great streaming option. One of the New York Jets that give up the 4th most fantasy points to DSTs on the season. So Zach Wilson left the ball game with a concussion. We don't know if he's going to play in next week's game for the Jets, but I think this is it for Zach Wilson anyway as the quarterback for the Jets. He had his one great game this season versus the Houston Texans, and every other game he played this year, he didn't get anything done. So it could be Trevor Siemian, who we saw at the end of this ball game, with Brett Rife, and 2 quarterbacks who aren't good at all and turnover machines. I think this Commander defense, they've done nothing all season on the defensive side of things or put up fantasy points at all. Could go into New York and have a decent ball game. I don't know if it's going to be Rodgers playing, even though he might be cleared in Week 16. I don't know why the Jets would risk it, because if he gets hurt again as Rodgers, his career possibly could be over. So if it's not Rodgers starting, this is a DST, a great streaming option, available right now in 86% of fantasy leagues. In the 5th and final defense DST I'm looking at off the wire is another team as a streaming option as well, available in 83% of fantasy leagues, is the Seattle Seahawks. So this Seahawks DST, for the most part, the last 6 weeks of the season, they really haven't done anything. But Week 16, a great matchup at the Tennessee Titans that give up the 10th most fantasy points to DSTs on the season. So this Titan offense, it's been a problem for the most part this season. We saw Will Levis get hurt at the end of that game, taking some big hits, and his body going in different directions. That's how bad he got hit at the end of that one to walk off. But Will Levis does play in this ball game in Week 16. I think the Seattle team, it's going to be a grind type of performance. They could get some pressure on the quarterback. And we know they got a ball hawk in secondary as well here, Seattle, where they've had some big plays in the season with pick sixes or just turnovers in general. So right now is a streaming option. What a good matchup at Tennessee. Well, not knowing if Will Levis is going to start or not after he got banged up in that ball game. They're streaming defense this week, so that's a few defense DST units I looked at off the wire for Week 16 of the fantasy football season.